If you want to change the story of power in civic life, you've got to learn how to describe a better alternative and then put it into action. Let's learn how. Let us now make our voices heard. I pledge to serve and to push my country. I pledge to live like a citizen. Welcome to Citizen University TV. I'm Eric Liu. On this show, we explore strategies of citizen power. And thus far, we've been looking at a group of strategies that we describe as changing the game. Well, today we're going to pivot to the next set, which is about changing the story. And we're going to focus in particular on this strategy here, describing the alternative. What do I mean by that? Well, in all politics, the simple fundamental rule is you can't beat something with nothing. You've got to be able to, if you're unhappy or dissatisfied with the status quo, to articulate and depict what that alternative would look like. And when we dive into this strategy, there are actually three component parts to it. The first, asking provocative and audacious what-if questions that begin to expand the frame of the possible and shift people's imagination. Second, describing a better way, actually articulating what that way looks like after you've awakened the imagination. And then finally, going to the notion of norms and creating a new sense of normal, a new sense of what's okay that allows people to shift their behaviors. So let's start with this question of asking what if. When you think about politics, so much of our focus is on the tactics and the mechanics, but we have to remember that so much of civic life begins in the imagination. And what if is the fundamental question of the imagination. A couple of examples here really illustrate the case. So Gloria Steinem, the fabled feminist activist, wrote in her memoir, My Life on the Road, about one very powerful tool she has used all her career, which she calls simple reversal. What does she mean by that? She gives the example of writing an essay, actually as far back as the 1970s, an essay titled, What If Men Could Menstruate? It's a provocative question. And she explores it more fully. She says, well, if you actually had that world, then we'd have an entire array of public policy, social norms, business accommodations that would be not only treating men and treating menstruation in a way that is different from what we see in the world today, but would be honoring it and valorizing it and treating it as a great heroic thing. It was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but more importantly, it was exposing the ways in which all of our sense of what's okay and normal have been baked into this gendered set of expectations. And so that what-if question was incredibly powerful at bursting that gendered bubble. In the same way, Black Lives Matter, just as a simple movement, is doing the same kind of thing. Now, it may seem like the hashtag Black Lives Matter is a declarative statement, but I have heard it, and so many people in this country have heard it, as a question, an implied question. What if Black Lives mattered? What if Black Lives mattered equally and fully? What if our institutions in criminal justice, education, employment, housing treated Black life as well and as equally as non-Black life? That is the implied question in this entire movement and the provocation of it in the way that it creates people's resistance as well as their sense of wanting to grab onto this movement. It is fundamentally a what-if question. Well then, this brings us to the second component and piece of our focus here today, which is describing a better way. Now, what does that actually mean? Again, you can't beat something with nothing. After you've expanded their sense of the possible with these what-if questions, you've then got to, in detail, lay out what that alternative universe could look like, what that better way would feel like. So a couple of very live examples right now of this. One is a growing movement here for the idea of a basic income. This is an idea that's been around in public policy circles for decades, the idea that every citizen should be granted some basic minimum amount of income that allows them to have economic security. It's an idea that actually, though it sounds kind of liberal, began on the right as a substitute for our vast, complicated welfare system and saying, let's just give every person a cash grant. That idea has bubbled around both here in the United States and around the world. Recently, Switzerland actually voted on the idea in a referendum. And though the idea lost in Switzerland, it was put on the map by that referendum. And now, here in the United States, an interesting cross-ideological movement of people, social justice liberals, limited government conservatives, other folks are starting to explore the potential of this idea of a universal basic income. That is a way of saying not only that it's unfair how much inequality there is right now, and that it's hard to make a living on today's wages, but it's actually saying here is a better way if everybody had this basic income. Now, in a different notion here, this image here actually is an image taken from an organization called Encore.org. And what Encore.org does is actually, in a different issue, describe a better way. And what they're talking about here is the thing that is actually upon us right now, the aging of the baby boom, and the entering of this vast generation into what used to be called retirement. But of course, as we know with baby boomers in this phase of life, as in pretty much every phase of life, they're beginning to redefine notions and expectations. And this idea of retirement, which in our minds and imaginations has always been about going off to golf courses and sitting around and doing a whole lot of nothing and kicking back, this generation is beginning to define not so much in a leisure-oriented way, but in a service and a contribution-oriented way. And Mark Friedman, the founder of Encore.org, has popularized this idea that this should be a second act of life, an encore act of life, that is focused on the greater good, the social good, and the civic good. And so Encore has been saying it's not enough to simply say there's kind of an emptiness or a hollowness to our current notions of retirement that are so materialistic, much less in the wake of the Great Recession when so many people haven't been able to live that kind of golden years dream. What Mark Friedman and Encore.org have been saying is there's a better way. Spend this chapter of life when you've harvested and harnessed all of your life experience up till now toward the greater good and civic ends, mentoring, tutoring, service of all kinds. That's what Encore.org is about. Well then, this brings us to the third and final piece of this idea of our strategy today, and that is creating a new normal. I love that little graphic we just had there, because the little dropping of hats there is one simple example of how, there was a time in this country's life where it was just normal that everybody wore hats, and then it wasn't so normal. Maybe it'll come back again. But the thing is that this notion of what's okay and normal is not fixed or God-given. This is a thing that we as citizens set off and shift in contagions of behavior. And so a few different examples of this that are live right now in our civic life. One here, you can see from this image here, is a movement that's going on all around the country here that gun rights activists call open carry. And as it sounds like, it's a movement basically to get legislatures to agree that it's okay to openly carry your firearms in public places, all kinds of spaces. That's, however, not just a matter of legislation, it's a matter of trying to shift norms. The idea that people should become get used to the idea of just folks walking down the street with long firearms slung over their shoulder. There's an image that's gone around the internet of a guy carrying an AK-47 while he's shopping for milk at Kroger's. And folks who are on the gun rights side are trying to normalize this idea. To a lot of people, that image seems kind of shocking, a little bit dangerous, a little bit bizarre. But those activists are trying to normalize it in a way that gets us used to the notion that, well, the Second Amendment allows us to openly carry firearms. On the other end of the political spectrum is a movement that actually began here in Seattle. This movement is called Shout Your Abortion, led by a group of activists who, watching around the country and seeing the ways in which many states and jurisdictions are contemplating restrictions on abortion rights, have decided again not to focus first on legislation, but to focus on social norms and to remind people in general, but women in particular, that abortion is normal. And the way they're doing that is actually just saying, shout your abortion, tell your story, make this a normal, okay thing, that there's no shame in having had an abortion or having needed an abortion. And they've created this movement that's begun on social media and has extended well beyond social media that, again, normalizes this idea. I wouldn't say celebrates it, but at least creates a sense that there is no shame and that you can walk in public life, having talked about, having experienced, having had an abortion, and that, as it says right here, abortion is normal. Now, you may agree or disagree with both open carry and the idea of normalizing abortion, but these are great examples of this renormalization, of shifting norms in a way that actually allows us to describe the alternative. Now, when we review this notion of describing the alternative, not in the national context, but here in our city of Seattle, we realize that these abstract notions get down into a very crisp and tangible way on an issue that touches many of our most vulnerable citizens. Let's take a look at that issue now.
Hello, my name is Rex Holbein. I'm an architect here in Seattle, and together with my daughter, Jennifer Lafreniere, we're beginning the Block Project. So the Block Project is a community building project that hopes to put one completely off-grid home in the backyard of a residential lot. Our goal is to put one on every single block in the city of Seattle to house the homeless. The block project began early on through facing homelessness. We recognized that if we're going to really truly end homelessness, we need to get all of community involved. And out of that grew this idea, this what if. What if we put homes in the backyards of residential lots as a means for housing the homeless?
I love all the trees back here, actually.
I would say our biggest worry from day one was NIMBYism, this not in my backyard. People have not gone there. They have actually done the opposite.
I'm Nathan Fearborn.
I'm Sonia Fearborn.
And we're taking part in the block project.
They have kind of fully embraced this to say yes in my backyard. In total, we have 27 families around the city that have said yes without really even asking.
Well, everyone kind of says, oh, good for you, and and I can tell, some people maybe wouldn't do it themselves, but I haven't had anyone that's thought it would be bad.
All of us can have compassion for one another and for the gifts that we have that feel good to share.
And I think this goes back to this idea that we all want to help. The homes are designed to be completely off-grid. All of the power comes from the sun. All of the water, including drinking, comes from rain catchment. And all of the waste, gray water, is taken care of on-site.
They do really work hard on matching you with someone that's going to fit with your family, and you get to meet them.
I'm Shelley Cohen. I'm taking part in the block project as a resident.
We don't think of it as a landlord-tenant relationship based on dollars.
When Rex introduced me to the family, he said it's like a match made in heaven.
This is a relationship of a friendship that's based on both people wanting to, to be there for each other.
And Shelley's easy to love.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, sweetie.
Thank you.
I love selling real change. Oh, that's a cute giggle. That made me so happy. But look what's under the smiley faces. The one-night homeless count.
That's not a good thing.
I used to sell real estate. Stats say you're 1 month away, potentially, from being homeless. I say 3 months, especially if you're a renter. They can be homeless in as long as it takes to get you evicted. Why not have one person in someone's backyard?
And our hope is to make it very successful in Seattle. If we do half of our goal, we provide enough housing to end homelessness.
We are just pleased that we can be able to provide.
There's this concrete way that we can actually impact it.
I think we're all meant to live more meaningful, more connected, rich lives in community with each other.
To be part of a family again, it's wonderful.
One fascinating example of describing the alternative in civic life is the emerging movement around what's called restorative justice. This is a movement that's arising in response to all that is wrong and broken in our criminal justice system here in the United States. And folks are describing a different way of thinking about the meaning of justice and the relationships that go into justice. Here to talk about that with us is Nicholas Bradford from the National Center for Restorative Justice. Welcome, Nicholas.
Great. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So unpack this term and this idea for us and how it's meant to rise alongside our, perhaps make obsolete, our current criminal justice system.
So what we talk a lot about is building a system, not tearing down the traditional system, but actually building a system that is in parallel and meets the needs of our community more effectively, better, and with more healing involved. And so we want to build that system in parallel to make this criminal justice system obsolete.
And so what does that look like? What does it mean to be restorative in justice, and restorative as opposed to what, simply punitive? Or?
Yeah, punitive and retributive. So that our traditional systems are very much based on punishment and retribution, revenge, kind of come through the system just in the language that we use. And the restorative language is really around relationships, around kind of connection and empathy. And so the definition that we use is a relational approach to conflict. When we're in conflict in all different kind of spaces. And how do we strengthen the relationship? How do we build a system that strengthens the relationship as we go through a really hard process?
So one paradigmatic example in my mind is in a school setting where a young person does some wrong and harm that might in other contexts end up leading him into what's called the school to prison pipeline, right? From detention and other things to eventually down the road engaging with the criminal justice system. And instead with restorative justice, there are these circles of conversation where that author of that misdeed actually comes face to face with the victim of it, I suppose, and in a circle of others, and take it from there. What happens in that circle?
So in restorative conferences or victim offender conferences, there's a lot of different language, but really we want to create space for the author to take accountability. And we use that language really clearly, taking accountability, not holding a young person accountable, because the system can't do that. But they step up into that space and say, like, this is what I've done, this is how it impacts people, creating space for the author, or the victim, to also advocate for themselves, to build skills around saying, hey, this hurt my feelings, this hurt me personally, this cost me money. And then also the community support. So both in the sense of community support being, we want to recognize that this is harmful, this action that was harmful, and then also recognize that we really want you here. I think that oftentimes we focus a lot on telling kids that they're bad, and that pushes kids out. That just really reinforces negative language around, I don't belong in school, da-da-da-da. And so how do we create a system that says, that's not okay, and we really want you here. You're super important to our community. And so we have a long conversation, we ask some particular questions. At the end of that, we really focus on the action of apology. What's going to happen now to make things better? And I want to make a particular point about that, is that when we're asking that question, we don't turn to the young person who's the author and say, what do you need to do now to make things better? But we ask everybody, who needs to do what now to make things better? And that's a really relational approach. That's really like engaging everybody. So the teacher, who's a supportive person, might say, I can do this, or I can step up a mentor. The victim might say, oh, I was partially responsible for this, and so I want to work with you to do the actions of apology. And then the author will obviously like step up into that space, hopefully, and do actions that are community service-based, or lessons for other classmates, or mentor younger students, or be a mentee from adults in the community. So there's lots of ways that we can have actions.
Alternative pathways that are other than simply the punishment and retribution then unfold from that. So one basic question is, thus far as these experiments have been spreading, both here in our region and around the country, is the most basic question, does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen mountains and mountains of data around both the juvenile justice system and the school systems. When they use restorative justice systems, you see great decreases in suspensions out of school retributive system or approaches. So Coal Creek Middle School is a great example in Oakland. It was a failing school for years, and this was probably around 8 or 10 years ago. They implemented, right before they were going to close, they were like, all right, we got two options. One, we close, or two, we implement this like risky approach. So they chose the risky option. They chose restorative justice. And you saw an 87% decrease in suspensions that first year, and then an additional 50% reduction in suspensions the following year.
So it's interesting because you use the word risky, right? And there's an acknowledgement of the risk here. And one dimension of it is, I think some viewers might just have this moral intuition that, hey, wait a minute, you're quote unquote letting someone get away with it, right? And instead of having them be punished for it, then you have this circle and everybody says, oh, it's my fault, and then the person who actually did the wrong sort of walks away, right? That's just a moral intuition that a lot of people have. I would imagine that's a big part of the risk, right, that you face. How do you get people, both in this, participating in this, and especially those observing it from the outside, to get over that initial moral intuition?
It's easy for people to say, not in a circle, who haven't participated in something like that, that's where kids are taking real, authentic accountability, say, that's not real, that doesn't do anything. But when you sit in circle, even police officers, probation officers, teachers, assistant principals, they sit in these circles and oh wow, that's what real accountability looks like and feels like when kids are taking public accountability, and not just kids but also teachers and other adults in our community can take real public accountability for what happened. And then the difference between the passive and the active approach, right? So do I want kids to receive a punishment, or do I want them to do something to make things better? And also build some skills so that doesn't happen again in the future, right? And we think that if we can all of our systems are pretty passive. Go to jail, sit in an incarceration cell for a while, go to detention in school and like stare at a wall for half an hour. Like those are kids where they do nothing except kind of point fingers at the system and the teachers and the other adults in their building to blame them. But when they're sitting down and saying, this is what I've done.
So besides that kind of moral intuition, what other challenges have you faced as you're trying to do this work of describing this better way, right? I mean, you're doing all the things that we talked about. You're asking, what if we had a different way of treating kids in these systems? You're laying out this better way, but then you're also saying this is a new normal, right? The norm here isn't just to throw them into detention or into a cell and throw away the key, but it's this different relational approach. What obstacles have you faced as you've tried to popularize this new alternative?
So there are lots of folks doing this work, and at the National Center, I want to make sure that we don't say that we're doing it right. We want to engage with all folks who are doing this work across the community, and so there is some consistency that's different in how people talk about restorative justice, and that poses problems in our community when we're going in, and people are hearing the story of restorative justice from 16 different people, and it sounds different from folks, and so
getting to common language is one
common language is a barrier that continually comes up. Then also like time. I mean, absolutely, it takes more time to sit down with young people and work through these processes. And a lot of us talk about the language of investment, right? We want to make an investment in the relationship, so we have to do a lot of pre-work before we're sitting in conferences. And then when we're sitting in conferences, we need to invest in that relationship. If we want young people to succeed, we have to invest.
So this is such a fascinating case study. We could go all day talking about this, but tell us quickly, what's the website for the national organization you run?
Yeah, so it's the National Center for RestorativeJustice.com. We're on Twitter at NC4RJ.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Nicholas. This has been really fascinating.
Great. Thanks for having me.
My guest has been Nicholas Bradford. He's head of the National Center for Restorative Justice. And restorative justice is a great case study in describing the alternative. So in this episode of Citizen University TV, we've been talking about one of the core strategies for changing the story of power in civic life. And that strategy is simply describing the alternative. And just to recap the component parts of that, it means asking provocative, imagination-shifting what-if questions. It means actually articulating the better way that you would like to see and to envision and put into practice. And then third, it means actually creating a new normal, a sense of shifted norms that allows people to change their behavior after their imagination and attitudes have also been shifted. In cases like the Block Project and the movement for restorative justice, you see all three of these in action, as well as all the other case studies we've talked about today. So when you think about what it means to describe the alternative, just remember, what if, better way, new normal. Well, now we like to actually spend some time hearing from you in this segment about social media questions. And we've gotten a couple of great ones here this episode. The first one here comes from Rob on Facebook. Is more civic engagement ever anti-progressive? He gave the examples, for instance, folks who are resisting increased density here in Seattle or pushing back against the idea of replacing parking areas for bike lanes. I think the short, honest answer is, of course, yes. There's nothing inherently progressive or conservative about civic engagement and civic empowerment. The question simply is, to what ends do you want to put this newfound political muscle and apply it toward? I think in a city like Seattle right now, we are seeing right now lots of people who are neighborhood activists who don't want more density, who like the way that single-family housing is zoned, and people who don't want more bike lanes. And they are organizing, and they are advocating, and they are pushing back. And for those who want these things, more density, more bike lanes, and the rest, the only thing to do is similarly to conduct the magic act of organizing and build more power that is countervailing power, and perhaps over time will be the power that prevails. But of course, I think it's important to remember that civic engagement is available to all, and the question simply is, who's going to show up? The next question actually is also in a different vein, super provocative. What is the role of schools to teach the science of civics? This question actually came to us on Twitter from Leipzig, Germany, from a group called Global ESD. And I think this is actually interesting for a couple of reasons. When you think about civics, civics isn't just the mechanics of how a bill becomes a law and so forth, but that when you recognize how we approach self-government, there is a science behind it. And one of the things that makes our time so interesting is that there is an emerging body of science about what's called complex adaptive systems. And you see this not only in natural ecosystems, in the science of botany, you see it in the science of physics, you see it in the science of economics. People recognizing that our society is not some perfectly efficient perpetual motion machine. Our society is an ecosystem. Our society is like a garden. And gardens, when left to themselves, may grow great for a while, but at the end of the day then, if left to themselves, noxious weeds take over and they kill those gardens. That's true of a neighborhood, it's true of an economy, it's true of a community. And so there's an emerging body of science now that I've written about in a book called The Gardens of Democracy that describes how we actually have to take this gardener's mindset to weeding, seeding, and feeding civic life, and recognizing that our behaviors, our actions, our inactions are rapidly contagious in this kind of ecosystem. That begins to change the way we think about civics and our responsibility as citizens. Well, we hope you'll continue to send us your questions and thoughts and ideas, and you can communicate with us all the time through various channels here. #CitizenUniversityTV. You can find us as well on Twitter and Facebook, and of course, old-fashioned email, contact@seattlechannel.org. We love hearing from you, and we want to keep on engaging in this conversation. Well, that wraps this episode of Citizen University TV. We hope that as you go forth and think about how you can put into practice some of what you've learned, you'll just keep in mind that if you want to change the story of power in any setting, you've got to be conscious of describing the alternative. Go forth and practice power. Thanks for watching. I'm Eric Liu. This is Citizen University TV.